What is good, everyone? For this video, I'm bringing another City 6, and this time I'm covering the city of Quito, Ecuador. And if you're not familiar with this series, the City 6, it's a new series here where I take all the major cities I covered on my major city work, 107, and I feature each one of them, breaking them down into 6 categories related to photography. I share what I liked about photographing that city, some of the challenges, if there were any. The number one question I get: what are the top spots for photography, specifically street photography? I'll share a photo walk that I recommend there. I'll share some tips for any photographers that want to go there. And then I'll finish off with some photos that I took there where we'll go into my computer and go a little deeper into them, and I'll share some details. And then throughout, I'll be sharing some photos that I took there too, kind of relating to what I'm talking about. So let's get into this edition of the City 6 on Quito, Ecuador. This was major city number 41 on my major city work. Now, Quito is the capital of Ecuador. It's actually the first city to have an UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's also up in the Andes Mountains, and there's a lot to like about it. For cities, I like unique cities. There has to be something that stands out, that separates it, and Quito is a unique city and has a few things that separate it from other cities. Now, the number one thing I'd say that I really liked about it, that also separated it from other cities I covered, is the mix of old and new when it comes to this region. Because you are up in the Andes Mountains and it is so old, you get that traditional lifestyle still living on, especially in the old town. You feel like you're back in time there. You have the cobblestone streets, the people still dress. A lot of the people still dress in the traditional outfits. So you feel all that culture and that history, both in the atmosphere and the scenery, but also in the people. But then you're also in a bigger city too, so you have that mix of city life too, kind of blends together. It's very interesting. You have the Andes Mountains in the background, you have the old city there, but then you can go into urban city too, and they do blend together. So that part's really interesting, I think, for photography especially. And number two, the place that really stands out in my memory of photographing is that first UNESCO World Heritage Site, is the old town there. And it's unlike any other old town really that I've been to, because you have old towns all around Europe and a lot of places, and you have old towns in a lot of Latin America too, but I would probably say between this one and Mexico City, this is the best one. And Mexico City's is bigger, but this one feels even older and just has maybe even a little more of that older character, I'd say. I really like shooting around there. And when I photograph Quito, that's where I spent most of my time. There's so many different places to go. It's mostly safe feeling. You have the architecture, Baroque architecture, you have the churches, you have a lot of different squares full of life, people everywhere, the narrow little alleys, the scenery, the backdrops. It just has so much. Markets. And it's very walkable and compact too, which is great. Everywhere you go, there's going to be some interest to photograph, and nice colors. It's just a great place to photograph there. So that's what number one thing that stands out in my memory is photographing the old city there. And in South America, I'd say it's the best one. Another thing that I really loved about Quito was the backdrops. You have the Andes Mountains in the background there, and it can make a photo much more interesting just having that in the background. Also gives you kind of a sense of place. And you get that in the old city, but outside of the old city, it gets a little less interesting because it's more of just of an urban atmosphere, Latin atmosphere, but then you still have the Andes Mountains in the background, so that adds a bit, especially when you get to like La Carolina Park, and I'll name some of my favorite spots there. But those mountains in that background follows you wherever you go, and it adds a lot to that atmosphere in Quito. That makes it pretty special. And another thing that I have to mention is how walkable it is, because for me, how walkable a city is at the top of my list for street photography. It just makes it so much more enjoyable to get out there and shoot, because every corner you turn, there's interest, you're never bored, and you don't have to take transportation, and Quito's great for that. Personally, I like to walk everywhere. I only take transportation if I absolutely need to, because if you're out there walking, there's always something that you might find, and in Quito, especially in the old town, you can walk everywhere. And even if you want to get outside of the old town, you can walk. So of course, if you really want to get outside, you take transportation, but there's just so much interest in the center there and a little bit outside the center that you can spend a whole day just walking the city without taking any transportation and have it be a packed full day. Now, when it comes to any challenges photographing in Quito, there's one thing I do have to mention, and it's not specific to photography for any visitor going there, is that there is a high altitude there, and I met a couple people there that just arrived, and they were kind of taken out of commission for a day just because of that change in altitude can get you. Now, me, it didn't really bother, though I did notice when I was out there, it is in the center there, it does get kind of hilly. Now, I'm used to walking all the time, obviously, on the major city work, including hills, but in Quito, I did notice I got a little winded a little easier on some of the hills there, and it was definitely had to do with the higher altitude there. And for some people, if they're going from one place to a much higher altitude, it can even make you a little sick. So be prepared for that. There are things you can do for that, which I'll share a little bit later in the tips, but that is something to consider. Now, another thing is, while the old town is amazing, getting outside of the old town, the amount of interest and character does drop quite a bit. When you're outside of Old Town, Quito's not so unique other than the backgrounds. It's a Latin urban city, which isn't always the most photogenic when it comes to backgrounds and things like that. So for once I was outside of the Old Town, it was less interesting and it wasn't quite as filled with life like it would be in the Old Town, so you really had to search for it. Now, it's still worth exploring the outside, especially I'd say in the different parks, but any visitor, especially photographers, will probably want to spend most of their time in the Old Town. And then another challenge really is a challenge when it comes to any bigger cities around South America or Latin America is safety. Now, I think, judging from the other places I covered, pretty much every major city in South America, Quito was one of the safer major cities I covered in Latin America, in my opinion. Now, I am comparing it to other Latin countries, so I wouldn't say it's safer compared to most cities. You do feel a lot of edge in sketchy areas if you're really exploring. And when it comes to the locals, they definitely warn you about being careful where you're at. So you do have to watch out. But if you have any experience in Latin American cities, especially, if you've been to Colombia or other major cities around South America, I think it's one of the better cities to go to, especially in the Old Town. Now, there's a few streets locals will tell you to stay away from, but I covered everywhere. And as long as you just watch where you're going and go out during the day, you should be okay. But you do have to have some street smarts and do watch out where you go if you're really exploring. And looking up crime statistics, it does back up my personal feeling when it comes to comparing to other major cities in South America. And one last thing that I will mention that I put in both categories of likes and challenges is that it's not very photographed when it comes to South American major cities, and a lot of South American major cities actually aren't that photographed because of dangers and things like that. But in Quito, it's a lot of interest, but not overly photographed, which I like. Now for the category that I'm asked about the most by far when it comes to my major city work, and that is what are the top places to go for street photography. And I have 5 that I'll name here that are all really good. And of course, I'm going to start off in the Old Town, but I'll name a few spots within there. Number 1, Plaza Independencia or Plaza Grande. That's the main square, the busiest square. That's also where you're going to see probably if there's any protests, like on the weekend, or there's always activity there, and it's just surrounded by things to see and streets too. It's just right in the heart of the Old Town. That's my favorite square in the city. But another plaza that I like in the Old Town is Plaza San Francisco, and that's right by a really nice church with the same name too. That's very interesting for photography. My favorite street in the Old Town, I'd say, is Calle Chile or Chile Street. And I love that street because you can take it from end to end, and that takes you through a couple of these squares, and it takes you by a lot of interest the whole way. You can go from shopping there's a market, and then you take that all the way. You go up a little bit, you go past squares, and the whole way you're just finding interest. You pass a church, you pass more shopping streets. It's just a lot of interest, and I would take that back and forth because the Old Town really isn't that big. It's just so packed with life and interest that it feels like it's bigger than it is, but really it's not. You can take this street up and down, back and forth multiple times a day. You'll get a change of atmosphere, light, and activity too. So it's really a street that I'd recommend above all other streets. Chile. Now, getting out of the Old Town, more into the urban part of the city, there's a couple spots that I'd recommend. One is La Mariscal, and there's a place called La Foche. That's a place where you're going to have some activity. There's restaurants, bars, things like that. There's a square there. So there's some interest there, and you'll get more of like the urban, local feeling there too, a city feeling. So it's not as active or packed as I'd say the Old Town, but for getting outside of the Old Town, it's one of the more lively areas. And you definitely get a different change of scenery from the Old Town. But really what I love about outside of the Old Town are the parks there. Now, if you walk from the Old Town to La Mariscal, which is a little bit of a walk, but I would I did it every time, so I would recommend it. And you will pass through a couple parks there, and one of the parks has a market there, so there's interest that you're going to pass through. There's a little lake, a man-made lake, but the park that I highly recommend is a little bit further out, and that's Parque La Carolina, or Central Park. And that's a huge park there, a lot of nature, a lot of activity. You'll see sports, people, you know, playing football or soccer. There's even an outside gym there, and then you have the backdrop of the Andes Mountains there. There's basketball courts, volleyball courts, and then of course green grass and everything you'd expect at a Central Park. So those 5 spots are the spots that I'd most recommend. Now you can explore outside of that too, but if you're in Quito, that should fill you with plenty of street photography opportunities. But when it comes to a photo walk I'd recommend, I have one right here, and this is for a full day of street photography. So if you'd like, if you don't have as much time or energy, break it up. But for a full day, start your morning at San Blas by Marin Central Bus Station, where you can start slowly walking northwest up Chile Street, and there's a market right by there too at the start. Now this area, people do warn a little bit about watching your belongings, but I never really had a problem there. But once you're on Chile Street, you should be good. While walking along Chile Street, take some time to stop and explore Plaza Independencia or Plaza Grande. Then continue walking northwest along Chile Street, stop around Iglesia de la Merced, then continue up past Mega Comercial Hermano Miguel shopping mall, big shopping mall, and there's some interest around it too. Then finish at Antonio Jose de Sucre y Mejia. There's a bus stop right there that can be kind of interesting too. And there's also a winding staircase that gets you to the top and an overpass that's interesting. From here, you can walk back southeast through the rest of the old town, making sure to stop at Plaza San Francisco. Then walk to the northeast end of the old town and explore around Basilica del Voto Nacional. From here, you can check out a change of scenery and walk to Alameda Park and El Ejido Park. And these are actually the parks that I mentioned earlier, but didn't mention their name, right? If you're walking from Old Town to La Mariscal. And if you have time, you can continue walking to La Foche and around La Mariscal too, around the park in La Carolina if you have a lot of time. And from there, you could finish your day out there or head back to the Old Town and finish it there for a change of atmosphere. So those are some spots and walks that I'd recommend in Quito. And now for some tips that I'd recommend. I mentioned earlier about the higher altitude, which can be a problem for a lot of people. For me, I didn't get altitude sickness, but I did meet some people that did. So there are things you can prepare for that. One thing is to stay hydrated, but even if you do get some altitude sickness, it should pass within a night. And when it comes to walking, you might be short of breath sometimes, so just bring some water and take it easy if you need, but it shouldn't be that bad. And when it comes to safety, there's really not a whole lot I can say other than be observant, watch your surroundings, spend a lot of time in the old town there where it's safer because they're more used to tourism and there's just people around everywhere and they don't want anything to happen right there. But on the outskirts of the old town is where you might see some sketchier areas. And then of course, if you're outside of the old town too, and then there's some nicer areas too though. So just be observant. There's not really any one spot that I'd say don't go to though. But the spots that I mentioned, you should be fine during the day, just with normal precautions. And then if you want to get outside of the city for a day trip, there is one very popular day trip, and that's Ciudad Mitad del Mundo, or the center of the earth. And it's Quito's #1 attraction, even though it's a little bit outside of Quito, but that is considered the center of the earth. And there's a big, monument showcasing that center of the earth, and there's things all around it though too. Even though it's mostly for tourists, there's some character too, and there's shopping, restaurants, things like that. So you can go there and see that and then do some photography. So those are just a few tips in Quito that I pass on. And now time for the last category, and that's photos. I know you've been seeing some of my photos already, but now I have a selection of a few that we're going to go into my computer and we can go in deeper and I can share some details behind them and behind Quito through them. So let's go. Okay, so I have a selection of around 10 photos I made while covering Quito, Ecuador, major city number 41 on the major city work. And this photo and the next few photos are taken around the old town. This is actually up kind of at the end of Chile Street I talked about, and you're getting around past Hermano Miguel, the shopping mall, and you go a little further, you'll get to the main bus area I talked about. But this area is a cool area, and the old town is kind of on a hill. And one thing I like is at the end, or the top part of the hill in the old town, then you can see the homes here that are built on top of each other like that along the hill. That adds a little bit of atmosphere in the background. But I took this photo trying to get that in the background a bit. Now the character of the old town changes a bit once you get to the outskirts here. It doesn't have that same old character. It mixes with the local character there, but it's still very interesting. And then you had a lot going on here. I came upon this scene. You have the traditional outfit of that woman here. You have the schoolgirls' outfits. I like that. And then she was, throwing a bit of a temper tantrum. And then the schoolgirls back here, schoolboy, and she's pointing. So I kind of took the photo right when there was a little bit of action going on there, trying to get them all in there and to get the character of the city. As you've seen, some people still dress in the traditional attire, especially around the old town in Quito. I liked her, and I like the child in the back here with the hat. She has a sucker or a lollipop, and then you have the workers over here sitting up like that. You have the arrow here, nice lines, and a little bit of the character of the wall there too. I got up closer and took some photos too, but this one kind of worked the best. One thing is a lot of people are eating ice cream around the old town. There's all these different people selling this very cheap ice cream. It's the type of ice cream that doesn't really taste like ice cream, but it's still good and soft serve. So you're going to see people eating ice cream everywhere. And I like this family here. Everyone's eating ice cream. And then right in the middle, you have this old statue here. So just kind of a funny scene there. This is right by Plaza San Francisco and the church with the same name right there. Popular spot to go to that I recommended. There's always a lot going on because there's also different shops that you can see right around it. And I like these different mannequins here, the colorful ones. It's a little bit odd feeling to me how they look. And then you have the people on this side here. This is the same church there. And I like the white wall there. And then you have her hat as she's looking down like that. You have some people there, some layers and some lines there. Again, with the traditional attire though. This is in the old town. This is again more near Hermano Miguel, the shopping mall there. And she had this little puppy there. So I try to get some layers in there, get close to the puppy. You have some nice colors here with the red. And I like her look too. Now we're getting outside of the old town. I explored a lot of different areas, but this isn't too far from the old town, but it's kind of heading, I'd say, north of La Mariscal. But I saw this boy on the ground here. He was sipping on that. And then I saw her point out like that, and it just kind of was an instinctual shot, and I took it there. So you have a few different things going on though. Now here we're at a park that I did mention, Alameda Park. It's really near the old town, but if you're heading toward La Mariscal, you're going to pass through it. And I like this park. As you can see, there's this man-made waterway here. They rent boats and things like that sometimes on it. But you have a lot of life there, and you have the backdrop of the mountains there. And I just like this couple as they walk by, the connection, and I like their character there, what they're wearing. And it was very candid. Now this photo is a little bit funny and odd, but I partly included it because I didn't mention this spot. It's worth checking out for the view, obvious view there. It's Panaceo, and there's a big statue right by us that you can't see there. El Panaceo, but it's the Virgin Mary, and it overlooks the city. But if you want a great view of the city, this is a spot to go to. Now you're not going to have a bunch of street photography opportunities because there's not a ton of people up there, but it's definitely worth checking out for that view. Now this was actually on the bus ride when I went to the middle of the earth that I talked about, but she had this doll in here, and then I saw the baby back there. So it was kind of a funny scene there with some character there too. And we'll finish off with this photo. This is probably the photo that most people know from my time covering Quito too. Now this is in front of a church, Nuestra Senora de la Merced, and it's also right off Chile Street that I talked about. And I really like this spot towards the end of the day because of the light you have here. And Chile Street's a popular spot, and you're going to have a lot of shopping. Sometimes you have street performers up here, and then you have this open area here right by the church. And on this day, I already saw that I had different things going on here with the man here, the woman here, and the different people. So I just tried to get up close and put it all together with that really nice light. But this area is definitely one of my favorite areas to shoot photography in the old town. All right, so I hope you enjoyed going through the photos there and the different information I could share from covering Quito, Ecuador. It's a great city that I highly recommend. I love cities where they have a mix of nature, character, history, you know, it has so much going for it, but also it's a big urban city too for Ecuador. It's the capital. So it just has a mix of influences from old to new, and just a great city and one of the best old towns I've seen around the world during all my major city work. So stay tuned for the next City 6. I think we're going to do these probably every couple weeks here in addition to the other videos. But the next city I think we're going to cover is Hong Kong, but we'll see. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video. Cheers.